This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Good evening everybody. My name is Dr. Paresh, Kathrani, and I am the practice coordinator here at the Refugee Law Initiative. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to the fourth seminar in the series New Challenges in Refugee Integration, co-hosted by the Refugee Council and the Refugee Law Initiative. I'd like to begin by apologising on behalf of the person who was originally meant to chair today's session, Mehdi Hassan. Regrettably, he could not make it and has asked me to convey his apologies. And I've been asked to step in, and I'd like to say it's a pleasure to do so. As I mentioned, this seminar series is being co-hosted by the Refugee Council. And the Refugee Council celebrated its 60th anniversary last year. And in the same year, it sustained a large statutory funding cut of about 60%. And as a consequence, many of its integration services have suffered. Despite losing 60 staff and suffering a one-third cut in its funding, Refugee Council has carried on providing valuable advocacy and advice to those who are in need of protection. And it has remodeled its services in the face of these funding cuts. For example, last year it began running a one-language telephone service to offer advice to asylum seekers and refugees, and this service has been taken up by thousands of people across London. Now, as I mentioned, this is a seminar series that's been co-hosted by the Refugee Law Initiative and Refugee Council on refugee integration. And integration is something that is becoming more fundamental in these current economic times, because in the face of funding cuts, there is a tendency to ostracize those who come from other places. And I'm sure that you may have read about some of the things that refugees have had to endure in the media. So this seminar series is timely. This is the fourth lecture in the seminar series, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Roger Zetter of Oxford University, who today will be delivering a talk on changing identities, declining protection, securitization of asylum and refugee policy in Europe. Professor Roger Zetter retired last year in September 2011 and is currently a Professor Emeritus at the University of Oxford. He was the fourth director of the Refugee Studies Centre, taking up his appointment in October 2006. He was the founding editor of the Journal of Refugee Studies, hosted by the RSC from 1988 to 2001. His research interests include the institutional and policy dimensions of forced migration and the impact of humanitarian assistance on refugees and asylum seekers. He is currently looking at two themes: European deterrence and restrictionism, and his second area of current research is environmental displaced people. He is a recipient of many grants. Recently, he obtained a grant from the governments of Norway, Switzerland, and UNHCR to look at environmental displaced people. He is currently being funded by the MacArthur Foundation to conduct a 2-year study entitled Environmentally Displaced People, Rights, Labels and Policies. He undertakes lots of work for the United Nations on urban displacement and humanitarian issues in urban areas. He's currently undertaking a project on cost and impact of refugees being funded by the World Bank. He's also looking at protracted displacement, and with respect to that, is being funded by the Norwegian government. As I mentioned before, his paper explores the interplay between the process of seeking protection and the notions of identity, particularly in the European context. And I'd like to say a couple of words, if I may, on the issue of refugee identity. Of course, when one thinks about the identity of refugees today, one tends to think in terms of their legal identity, how they're defined by the Geneva Convention. One tends to associate the identity of a refugee with someone who has escaped a well-founded fear of persecution from their country of origin and has come to another place looking for protection. But of course, identities aren't fixed, they're malleable, and they're subject to many external forces. Governmental policies, the way in which governments perceive refugees, the way in which the general population perceives refugees, the way in which the media often portrays refugees. So it would be wrong to think of the refugee identity as being fixed. It's malleable given these number of forces. And today, Professor Zetter will be talking about how this identity is shaped, particularly in the European context. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Roger Zetter.
Thank you very much indeed for that very full and fulsome introduction, and I think an excellent synopsis of what I'm going to be talking about tonight, and it is indeed a great pleasure to be here to talk to you. The paper that I want to give, as Paresh was saying, really explores this kind of interplay between the process of seeking protection and refugee identity, and how notions of protection, particularly how protection is conceived, helps to shape and form and stereotype a refugee identity. And what I want to argue is that, in fact, this process of creating identities has very much become a kind of situated process rather than a narrated process by the refugees and asylum seekers themselves. And that situating process has really been a practice of expropriating identity, I'm going to argue, by European governments and their institutions, which has very profound effects and implications for how refugees are identified and how their access to protection is governed and, I'm going to argue, restricted. The paper that I want to give is really in three sections. I want to open up the discussion with a brief theoretical exploration, really, of the nature of identity, how identities are shaped, how they're narrated. And then I want to move on to the second part of the talk tonight, where I'm going to be talking about the cornerstone of refugee identity, and particularly the legal and normative frameworks of protection embodied in the 51 Convention and the Protocol, and explore how that very important convention has shaped and reshaped and indeed sought to develop a kind of malleable response to the nature of refugee protection, given the very varied social and political meanings that protection has to governments and to refugees themselves. Very much looking at the kind of institutional processes which have shaped the changing nature of that identity, and with it the changing structure and performance of protection. And then in the main part of the paper, I want to focus on the European Union member states and illustrate these concepts and processes. And what I'm going to argue, as I suggest in the title, is that the European member states, both as a union and as individual sovereign states, are being confronted, as we know, with an increasingly diffuse and complex process of global migration, particularly refugee movement in the last 2 decades primarily, and that by deploying an agenda of securitizing asylum seeking, the member states have formed and transformed a specific refugee identity in ways that conform and legitimize the very process of narrowing obligation and commitments to protection. And at the same time, and transcending these kind of objectives, I also want to argue that identifying refugees and asylum seekers as a potential security threat to Europe and Europeans, this has reinforced the wider European project of developing Europe as a space, that I quote, of freedom, justice and security. And it's this notion of security which is the kind of leitmotif ultimately of the paper I want to give tonight. I actually want to start with an anecdote, really, to really introduce some of the ideas and some of the themes that I'm going to be talking about, and highlighting some of the challenges in shaping an understanding of this situated and narrated identity of refugees and its implications for protection. The anecdote is really built around a postgraduate student I had a few years ago who used to sit outside my office and then come to tutorials, always reading an Italian newspaper, Corriere della Sera, or one of the many sports newspapers that are published in Italy. He spoke English with an Italian accent. He dressed in very elegant Italian clothes. But he was actually a black Italian. And that, of course, is a very novel conjuncture of identities, because obviously only recently has Italy become a country of immigration rather than mass emigration. And unlike some other European countries, public acknowledgement of this new reality of a multicultural society is still very contested terrain. But anyway, my stereotypes were kind of challenged, if you like, by these disjunctive characteristics. Was he a refugee? And obviously with my own background of 30 years work here, I suspected that might be the case. What was his real nationality? I needed to give him a label, I needed to give him an identity. But what kind of identity could I ascribe to him, and how did he identify himself? And how were these different notions of identity mediated by his own life, his own experience, and the labels that had been ascribed to him? We never discussed this directly, but over the year that I was teaching him, and we discussed various issues, and he worked on his thesis paper and seminars and so on, it seemed to me that he actually had 6 different identities. He was actually a Somali by birth. He was an asylum seeker because of 20, 30 years of civil war. Thirdly, he was a refugee by the 67 Protocol in need of protection. Fourthly, he became an Italian citizen, really by the historical sort of consequences or the accidents of history, really, of Mussolini developing an Italian empire in the Horn of Africa in the 1930s. He came to Britain. He was a UK resident with his family by virtue of the Single European Act, which permitted the free movement of European citizens. And finally, sixthly, he was a diaspora Somali. A lot of his income that he generated here was repatriated to Somalia, part of the social obligations of Awala. I put these kind of institutionalized identities in a kind of chronological, in a kind of time series. But I suspect that for him they overlapped, these multiple identities, they coexisted in different and very complex ways. And they were not sort of taken for granted, stable and predetermined. Rather, they were rather necessary, fluid, and a highly instrumental part of his life. But of course they were imposed identities, they were situated identities. I situated them. They said little about his social world, they said little about his home, his sense of belonging, settlement, return, his notions of national identity and locality, the social norms and family aspirations. So in other words, there was a partial determination of his identity. Not the narrated identity, but as I said, an ascribed or situated identity. On the face of it, he seemed like a kind of archetypal, assimilated, integrated migrant and refugee. He ticked all the boxes quite clearly. And he was an archetypal, mobile European citizen moving from Italy to Britain in a very easy way. But he obviously had a plurality of affiliations as well. Coexistence of cohesion with a separateness, a belonging here and a belonging there. And it fitted uneasily with the identity of a refugee who should be integrated and settled here and perhaps not mobile in a European sense. But he is also obviously a member of the transnational society, the diasporic community of Somalis across the globe, a virtual community of globalized migrants. And he would repatriate money as quickly as I could get it out of the ATM with using my debit card. So in some senses he was living here, but part of a deterritorialized identity was an important part of his own being, very much sort of following the ideas of people like Daniel Warner and Lisa Malky. So in other words, these kind of 6 identities, this stereotype, described, label, failed to capture the richness and the multi-layered identity. of him, or indeed one of the many millions of refugees or forced migrants seeking the identity of refugee in Europe over the last decades. And like those many millions of refugees and asylum seekers, his identity, I would argue, is determined less by what he is, but more by perceptions, in this case my perceptions of what he might be. And it's this kind of dichotomy, this dilemma, particularly in the context of securitizing the notion of refugees and asylum seekers, that I want to talk about. So let me say a little bit really about some of the kind of theoretical ways in which we might kind of understand these disjunctive characteristics. We like to think that we can determine our own identities and that we are instruments of our own self-representation. But as we know, we're as much the product of how other people see us and the characteristics that we attribute to other people, as indeed I was attributing to him. We ascribe certain kinds of qualities, and they're rooted in many aspects of our personal, our behaviour, our social development, and they shape and constrain who we are. They may reinforce our self-image, and they may reflect some aspects of identity that perhaps we prefer were not so highlighted. We're not free to choose what others attribute to us, but we can respond to these imposed identities in different ways, just as refugees do. We can conform, we can comply, we can protest, we can go underground, we can challenge, we can deny, we can ignore these identities. And just as individual identities are ascribed, and in a sense we respond and are shaped by these ascriptive qualities, so the same applies to social groups, like refugees. And in the work of Goffman, who for many years has been a very important kind of touchstone of my own thinking about issues of labelling and identity, in his classic studies of asylum inpatients, not asylum seekers, but inpatients in asylum hospitals, Goffman showed that just is in the same way that individual identities are imposed and ascribed, so in terms of social groups, and particular kinds of social groups, selected attributes are also identified and normalised, or stereotyped, so that deviants, as asylum seekers used to be conceived of, conform and fulfil the expectations that are ascribed to them, behaving not how they are, but how others would wish them to behave. In other words, a creation of the other. And Goffman's work, I think, speaks very powerfully to those who are symbolically confined and marginalised in asylums, and arguably the same, I think, applies to asylum seekers and refugees in Europe. And these groups are identified, defined, and reinforced by selected attributes. And I'm going to be talking about these selected attributes in a little while, some of which are perceived to be problematic and less desirable, and frequently discounted. But what is happening here is that this ascriptive process, I think, plays a very complex role, not just in describing an identity, but also making an identity of social groups. What Goffman's work, I think, also speaks to very powerfully is that this construction of identity as a social process is very much a process of ascription, which bears the hallmarks of institutional power, professional power, institutional power. So we're immediately talking here about questions of governmentality, because we live in an institutionalized world where processes of identity formation are imposed on us by government, by public bodies, by public policy particularly, and then more particularly by the particular institutions we might live in, work for, and so on. And there's a kind of narrated process between the self and the situated self. In other words, these identities are very powerfully constructed, sometimes with our connivance, sometimes with our support, sometimes with our resistance by institutions, bureaucracies, governments, and so on. So it's in this milieu, I would argue, that our identity is rhetorically constructed, if you like. And like other groups, refugees therefore need to kind of negotiate this framework of legal designation, state practice, the everyday language of their description in newspapers and the media, the political rhetoric which so infuses debates about refugees and asylum seekers, which Paresh alluded to start with, and then on their own account, on the other hand, on their own account. And this interplay between the situated identity and the narrated identity is, I would argue, absolutely critical. And so, whilst the idea of a refugee label is constructed around the need for protection, and clearly protection itself plays a crucial role in constructing the identity, I would argue that this perhaps is often misconceived or misappropriates certain assumptions about the identity of the refugee, how the notion of protection, let alone whether protection itself is a sufficient commodity, if you like, that refugees need access to, how it's constructed, how we understand notions of protection, and how we discount other aspects of the refugee's story and construct it as a case, a bureaucratic or legal case. This kind of construction process, I think, has very profound, and I'm going to argue very disempowering consequences for refugees and asylum seekers. So moving to the second part then, how do these albeit very brief and somewhat sketchy discussions of identity and identity formation, how do they relate to refugees, refugee identity and protection? From the start, refugee identity, I think, has been largely ascribed, grounded in law, particularly in the 51 Convention, and constructed around three important intertwined principles. A, the well-founded fear of persecution. Secondly, outside the country of origin, and thus the defining attribute, thirdly, in need of international protection. Now, interestingly enough, international law nowhere defines protection, although in the 60 years since the 51 Convention, protection has been elaborated in many, many different and complex ways, but never defined in law. So a legal definition of a refugee, established on these explicit and unique criteria, was of course a construct of its time. And part of the challenge, which I'm not going to be talking about tonight, for the UNHCR and many other governments, has been how that construct of time has been developed, shaped, restricted, reconfigured over the last 60 years. Of itself, the Convention and those three parameters did not make an identity, but it framed an identity in terms of a specific social membership, a specific identity, a specific social identity in terms of the 5 classic grounds of persecution, in terms of spatial displacement across an international border, and around a specific claim, the claim of the need for protection. Yet the power of this original legal definition, and the people indeed who made those definitions, in ascribing certain defined characteristics to the category of refugee, have been very instrumental in shaping that identity and the experiences of those who are categorized in the last 6 decades. And whether or not these three conditions are necessary components of refugee, I would argue they're certainly insufficient of themselves, and there are a number of tensions, I think, in the way that identity has been formed and shaped in these terms. And I think there are perhaps 3 or 4 points I want to make here. I think the first conclusion one can draw about the way in which the refugee identity has been conceived in the 51 Convention, these 3 parameters, as I call them, is that it's produced a constructed identity which largely serves the needs of states. And refugees don't easily fit into these seemingly clear-cut categories and these criteria. And of course, whilst the focus on protection leads to the conclusion that this is an essential need, a right, perhaps even a privilege in Europe these days, it's always been assessed in relation to the other 2 criteria. In other words, membership of a particular social group, one of the 5 groups of persecuted people, and crossing an international border. But as we know too well, refugees are the product of very complex social and economic conditions which precipitate conflict and violence and then may cause people to flee. And an identity that is framed around the requirements of space, spatial disposition or spatial displacement, membership of a social group reveals, I think, very little about the macro and the micro processes and the kind of political economy which predispose people to, or propel people to leave their homes, flee their countries, and indeed, of course, the extent of agency and volition or compulsion which they might enact in those kinds of circumstances. And so the need of protection and the needs of refugees, and as a defining feature of refugee identity, the need for protection, understood in terms of the 51 Convention Protocol, may be necessary, but it may be amongst many other expectations or requirements and background, if you like, that leads refugees to flee their homes. Secondly, I would argue that the identity conceived around the notion of protection is too prescriptive a grounds for claiming refugee status in the contemporary world. And this is because it's not only people exposed to specific forms of tyranny and persecution who may wish or may need to claim protection and refugee identity, but as we know, those who are exposed to much more generalised violence or conflict, increasingly perpetrated by non-state actors and so-called fragile states. Classic example of the anecdote I started with. And of course, moreover, today, fewer and fewer people actually are persecuted or exposed to conflict and violence across borders. Protection may not be contingent on displacement at all. As we know, the numbers of internally displaced people as a result of conflict are perhaps almost 3 times the number of officially recognised refugees worldwide by the UNHCR. So here we're dealing not so much with protection in its purest sense, but with the breakdown of political relations between citizens and the state, and the extent to which fundamental rights are no longer safeguarded or protected, irrespective of the kind of destination or the nature of displacement. And Andrew Shacknow's paper, which I think many of you will know, Who is a Refugee, 30 years old now, that paper was, but speaks, I think, very powerfully to this notion of the breakdown of the bond between the citizen and the state, and that displacement and protection, the terms considered and constructed in the Convention, may not be necessarily appropriate or easy to apply in a rigorous sense. I think a third challenge in terms of identity and protection prescribed in the 51 Convention is that it's framed around an individual claim. And this has very complicated implications. Because whilst an individual may claim protection, the status is determined not as a right, but as a series of usually contested entitlements in the host country. And this contestation, I think, produces very different entitlements and levels of protection, and therefore different identities. And as we know, these 5 social groups, in broad terms, are key markers of identity, and indeed the claims for protection on grounds of privilege, grounds of persecution or privilege on these 5 specific groups. But proving membership of one of these persecuted groups, in other words, proving an identity, is judged not by the individual, but is imposed by the institutionalized processes in the country of asylum, and the process an asylum seeker goes through to prove his persecution around those 5 classic grounds. And arguably, this kind of procedural and institutional process of refugee determination is almost the kind of inversion or the reversal, if you like, of the principles by which the 51 Convention sought to achieve a certain universalistic set of markers of who was a refugee. And I think these paradoxes highlight very powerfully this dichotomy that I started with between the case and the story of how a refugee ascribes her or his own identity, and the case, the imposed, the bureaucratic definition of who you are and who you belong to. Fourthly, I think that whilst international law and the norms of institutions have come to ascribe and structure particular identities of refugees, At the same time, they are not absolute. And like others, refugees' lives are indeed structured and mediated by these institutions and norms. They're not polarities. And refugees exercise agency in all kinds of ways. And I'll come back to this when I'm talking more specifically about European policy and the agency in terms of being illegal and undocumented and so on. Processes by which, from one perspective, refugees and asylum seekers appear to subvert an identity in order to make claims for protection. So the notion of an imposed identity as opposed to the agency that refugees themselves and asylum seekers themselves may present, I think again, creates quite sort of problematic questions when we're seeking to say who is a refugee, what is her identity. And of course I think this is particularly problematic in the contemporary world of global displacement, where the boundaries structuring refugee agency have shifted and changed in quite contradictory ways. On the one hand, what we find is that refugee identity is conflated with other broader policies and practices, particularly in Europe, which are designed to regulate and restrict immigration into Europe as a whole. So the particular claims, if you like, of refugees as a privileged group of migrants are conflated with a more general policy frame, which is, as I say, broadly restrictionist of immigration. And on the other hand, the claim to refugee identity is less and less valorized by humanitarian precepts and principles of protection, but narrowed to very, very specific and regulated rights-based entitlements. And again, I think a very ironic reversal of what the 51 Convention was aimed at. A broad set of norms, a set of universalistic criteria by which identity might be ascribed and developed. And so the multiple identities that refugees possess, the multiple identities I alluded to with my student at the beginning in that anecdote, are now constrained to a small and a singular and a very restricted variable. A declining space in which refugees can exercise agency, much less room to maneuver and narrate and prove their social identity. So moving then to the main part of the paper, illustrating how some of these theoretical positions I've identified, and then some of the more instrumental questions and challenges and issues that arise from the notions of identity and protection, the juxtaposition, the conjunction, the disjunction perhaps between protection and identity emanating from the 51 Convention. How are these played out in the context of European asylum and immigration policies and practice? And I specifically want to focus on just one dimension of this, the securitization of asylum. And the core of my argument is really this, that within the context of globalization, of the globalization of migration, the globalization of people on the move, identifying who is a refugee has become increasingly complex and challenging, both conceptually and certainly in terms of policy and practice. Changing forms of persecution, changing processes and spatial scales of forced and voluntary migration are some of the key factors which underscore these challenges. And it's in response to these transformations and the discursive practices of the receiving states in Europe that a refugee identity is being constructed, I think, in very significant ways, often contradictory ways, but always prejudicial, I think, to the rights and entitlements and the expectations of the claimants themselves. If we look at the globalization of migration, first of all, we see a kind of paradox, of course, because globalization, first as an economic process and now as a security concern within Europe, has profoundly affected the political landscape of Europe. And one could argue that the global movement of people, the political saliency of immigration, is arguably really disproportionate to the overall scale of migrant population worldwide. And of course there's a kind of paradox here that the neoliberal economic imperatives which have opened up world markets and have really provided the kind of the dynamic for people to move globally is now seen as a major challenge to the sovereignty of states, and is very much part of the explanation, I think, of EU-wide resistance to migration now, animated first of all by political concerns about domestic social economic consequences of large numbers of migrants on the move, a perceived threat to social cohesion, and so on and so forth, which a national identity which migrants in general and asylum seekers in particular were thought to impose. But more specifically, I think, and specifically aimed at refugees and asylum seekers, national and EU-wide discourses on securitization and migration and human security of migration have intersected these broader concerns, the political economy discourse, if you like, on migration. And a primary objective now on the European member states is to manage migration, and that objective is driven by a perceived need to securitize national populations underpinned by the fear of the other. And it is sustained by a rationale on the one hand of good community relations, social cohesion, and so on and so forth, with an increasing diverse mix of ethnicities. And of course the economic imperative to manage domestic labour markets. But behind that, I think, is another discourse, and a very powerful discourse, and it's a discourse of securitization. And both these discourses, the political economy, social cohesion discourse, and the securitization discourse, I think reinforce a very negative, they ascribe a very negative identity to refugees and those seeking asylum in the UK, in the EU, and diminish the scope, the opportunities, the potential to access, and the quality of protection as well. When I talk about human security, I'm talking about it not so much in terms of individual rights, but more in terms of the broader, sort of more malleable interpretation of securitization of individuals within the framework of much larger entities, the nation state and its value systems. And in Fuzan's who's done a lot of work on securitization, what he terms securitizing them, these values and these national identity characteristics from so-called existential threats. But as he points out, the question of existential danger evoked by securitizing our values, securitizing our identity, the existential danger evoked by securitization of potential risk need not necessarily be a real risk, only a perception that current structures, policies, values, social variables and so on are likely to be threatened, not a material and actual existential threat per se. And the intensity and persistence of the threat which we are securitizing against is usually correlated to the way in which this is institutionalized through all kinds of practices, and UKVA is a prime example of those kind of institutionalization, if you like, of the concern about the security threat and the regulation of who comes, not so much who leaves. But this process of securitizing national and international European-wide concerns about the threats to our so-called values, our so-called social cohesion, and so on, I think have had, as I say, a very dramatic effect on how refugee protection has been enacted. These security threats have been legitimised, and particularly around the restrictions on refugees and asylum seekers coming to Britain, in the minds of European policymakers, obviously, first of all, by 9/11, by the bombings in Madrid and the London bombings in 2004-2005, and to a lesser extent by episodes of civil disorder, sometimes involving ethnic minorities in the UK, France, Netherlands and Italy and so on. And that is not to deny that these, certainly the bombings in London and Madrid, were significant but also very symbolic and real threats. But my argument is that they have been used in a very instrumental way to shape a conceptualization of security threats which has played out very disadvantageously with respect to European asylum and European asylum seekers and refugees. And of course the imputed links between asylum seeking, the existential threat and terrorism is obviously one part of this broader discourse, if you like, on multiculturalism and immigration, which has pervaded European policy making for many decades. And sort of thinking about this paper, I was thinking back to this somewhat amusingly but ironically named Trevi Group, if any of you remember that, almost 40 years ago, which was the first attempt that European governments made to link migration, particularly asylum seeking, with the potential security threats. And the Trevi Group did not refer to the founders of Rome, but to terrorism, radicalism, extremism, and violence international. And it was, as I say, this first way in which a conceptualization of a securitization threat, and particularly posed by immigration and asylum seekers specifically, that kind of coalition of interests was first constructed. And this refugee identity as security threat nexus, I think we can see this constructed in several ways, and there are 4 points I want to make before I conclude. First of all, many of the countries that are producing the largest number of refugee claims lodged in European member states, from countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, 20% of European claims for asylum come from Somalis, are often in those countries whose religious affiliations and lack of security, interesting and ironic reflection of the European agenda of freedom, security, and so on. But many of these countries whose affiliations and lack of security are identified as being the most threatening to national and international security in Europe, yet ironically it is precisely these same challenges to human security, fragile governments, limited ability to protect the rights of individuals from persecution and violence, which constitute, of course, the normative basis for the well-founded fear of the claim for protection through refugee status. So there's an interesting kind of paradox here, that what we deem to be in our interest to secure our own identity and values and protect our own people is precisely what it is that refugees are seeking as well, and they're fleeing exactly the lack of that kind of protection and security. But being ascribed a threatened identity because of the kind of origins that the predominant number of asylum seekers come from greatly diminishes the strength of their claim for asylum within European member states, so that those most in need of protection from their own states and conflict and violence and persecution in their own states paradoxically find it increasingly hard to assert their claims precisely because of this ascribed identity. Their case, if you like, is constructed from selected markers of their country of origin. Another dimension, I think, of this identity-forming discourse is exemplified by the way European member states have tried to distinguish between and then regulate the complex yet fluid patterns and processes of contemporary migration, simplifying these stories into very specific cases and statuses, which are often prescribed by political agendas, such as securitization. So very often differentiation and conflation of identity go hand in hand, and I think a very good example of this kind of problematic is the considerable energy that has gone down into narrowing and codifying the conditions of refugee status determination in Europe, such as the Qualification Directive and the very protracted attempts to produce a common asylum and immigration policy. Notwithstanding the difficulties, European member states have had to develop a cohesive approach to this. It has nonetheless enabled European member states to strengthen their immigration policies and practices, while at the same time it's enabled them to transform and politicize labels which suit this agenda of regulation and restrictionism against bogus asylum seekers. And I think this leads to a third point, really, a third kind of problematic, if you like, in this dialogue, if you like, of this discourse between the described and the narrated identity and the means of protection. By creating the identity of an illegal migrant, or perhaps less pejoratively, an irregular or undocumented migrant, I think this provides another example of the way in which this has been used to reinforce the agenda of securitization. But as researchers like Roos and Anderson show, the simple doxic, if you like, or dichotomy between the legal and the illegal is by no means clear-cut in practice. They identify more than 80 different ways in which you can enter different categories of migrant into the UK. And that's just from the institutional perspective, and it certainly doesn't conform to migrants or asylum seekers' own conception of their status and their agency. And conflating all these different categories, I think, serves the securitization agenda by reinforcing the existential threat represented by migrants who are perceived as bogus or abusing rights of sanctuary and protection and welfare support. But of course, illegality is a constructed concept. It's not an a priori or an objective condition. Asylum seekers who enter illegally are not criminal per se, as their ascribed identity implies. But the tightening of entry routes, visa requirements, the machinery of deterrence has created conditions where even those who have the most powerful claim for protection risk being identified as bogus asylum seekers or economic migrants, and not surprisingly go underground. Because we want asylum seekers to be ascribed a stereotypical victim identity. And when that identity doesn't conform to the stereotype, when they use their agency to arrive illegally, we designate them as opportunists with no call on our moral obligations. So the notion of the asylum seeker as illegal, as clandestine, as criminalised, resonate very powerfully, as we know, with a public rhetoric on migration and asylum seeking, which increasingly politicised and is increasingly politicised and managed as a security threat. People who are arriving illegally, if you like, almost by definition, must threaten our security. Fourth point I would make is that the European securitization and migration management agenda has its own political logic and momentum. At times it's been very instrumental and convenient if selectively used to promote the European project of economic integration, communitarian identity, etc., etc. At other times, migration has posed a lot of problems for the European project, and Boswell, amongst others, notes both this tension between the opportunism that migration has been used to develop the economic liberalisation of freedom of movement within an enlarged European continent, an enlarged European Union, and this protection discourse that's related to refugees. So on the one hand, we have this borderless Europe from the Single European Act, from the Maastricht Treaty, and so on, which occurred just at the same time, really, when there was a steep rise in spontaneous asylum seekers in the 1990s, arriving in Europe, late 1980s, early 1990s. And so the immediate response was the Dublin Convention to try and narrow down, if you like, the potential of migrants in general and asylum seekers in particular accessing Europe, a space of freedom and mobility. And by criminalising the rights enshrined in the Convention, majority labelling the process of asylum shopping, which is in effect what the Dublin Convention did, and thus by implication undermining the claims of legitimate asylum seekers, these European instruments both diminish the quality of human security available to asylum claimants and reinforce the perception that somehow people trying to subvert these policies were a security threat. So there's a kind of, if you like, a kind of conjunction really between the way in which the European-wide policies themselves were instrumentalised. They created a threat, and lo and behold, somehow refugees, asylum seekers conform to that threat. And just on the aside, I think it's very interesting last year, particularly with the outflow of migrants from Libya and Tunisia, the way in which that process of entry into Europe, numbers were very small, just blew a very wide hole in the Dublin Convention, when France and Italy, in a sense, almost broke the meaning of that convention, which I think was good news. So by switching asylum to the first pillar status, which happened in the Treaty of Amsterdam, I think this was a decisive point in this process, because by making these issues of who is a refugee, of identifying asylum seekers developing common policies of reception and determination, by making these matters of community competence and setting them in a more robust normative framework of the European Union of freedom, justice and security. It kind of legitimised this process, if you like, this communalisation, if one might put it like that, of asylum and immigration policies and the potential threat, if you like, that those who were trying to subvert those processes, and asylum seekers were seen to be people of that ilk, this became, I think, a very sort of problematic process, but at the same time, by creating it as a European-wide, a 27-country-wide process, it added, I think, an extra twist to this process, by which locating migration control at the heart of this dualistic link between freedom on the one hand and security on the other. It's almost come full circle back to the Treaty Agreement almost 40 years ago. So what we see is this process reinforcing in a profound way the need to institutionalise this cardinal principle of securitising Europe by strictly regulating migration. And it's been, I think, at the cost of the diminution of protection for those most in need of it. And obviously the media highlight particular instances, the terrorist bombings and so on. But where those apprehended are actual, maybe putative terrorist bombers, they may or may not be asylum seekers or refugees, but all are tainted with this, this label. One or two may indeed be guilty, but securitisation demands that any asylum seeker could be identified as a terrorist, the existential threat that Poussin speaks so powerfully to. I think a fifth point is that by reframing and stigmatising asylum seeking as a threat to a secure and free Europe actually ignores the fact that the prosperity of Europe in the last 15 years has largely depended on all European governments, particularly in Western Europe, turning a blind eye to undocumented economic migrants, including illegal asylum seekers. Our prosperity, at least until the last couple of years, has largely been built on certainly a very substantial number of undocumented migrants coming to Britain. Some other work that I've been doing looks at figures varying between about 300 to 750,000 undocumented migrants. But there's little doubt, and there's, I think, a substantial amount of evidence by urban sociologists and economists to show that both in Britain and in many Western European countries, our prosperity is largely depended on their arrival, their willingness to work for below minimum wages and so on and so forth. They provide the service in the sense that sustains our economic prosperity. But this kind of contradiction, if you like, we stigmatise asylum seekers, yet highly dependent on illegal, undocumented migrants to sustain our economic well-being. This kind of contradiction, which simultaneously deters and restricts refugees and asylum seekers, identifies them as a threat to our cohesive national identity, yet promotes their, if you like, their indirect arrival, I think is a contradiction which, again, is an inevitable consequence of the securitisation agenda. And again, sits very uncomfortably with other very instrumental policies to promote cohesion, assimilation of migrant communities, and so on. So this process of conflating and aligning identities and threats from immigration in particular, and asylum seekers, immigration in general and asylum seekers in particular, at times separating out the two categories, at times putting them together, I think, has further diminished the unique claims of asylum seekers. And reformulating as a kind of convenient single issue of protecting Europe from the threat of large-scale and spontaneous population movements and the security threats that that implies, I think has been a very effective, but in many ways a very sinister outcome of the securitisation agenda. Balancing freedom and security has permeated policy making for almost 2 decades. But as I say, I think it's been a very insidious political rhetoric and policy apparatus which has used securitisation to sustain and develop this framework and this response and the diminution of protection. So let me conclude then, just focusing on this one policy variable, European securitisation, I've attempted to show how the situated identity of asylum seekers and refugees has been symbolically constructed or expropriated, if you like, to exploit the anxieties and the perceived threats to another loosely constructed identity of Europeanness, even if those fears are really only tangentially related to migration and the process of seeking asylum. The risk, as I've argued, is partly conceived as a violation of physical security, but mainly and really much more powerfully, much more insidiously, in terms of very imprecisely defined threat to our value systems and European ideologies. And in this way, managed migration and the identity of asylum seekers are part of this wider European project to position and define European member states and the Union as a whole in relation to the other, the migrants and the asylum seekers, and thus in relation to particular understandings of what the European community is and what it is not. But at the same time, problematizing migration, in particular asylum seeking, with connotations of illegality, misrepresenting the identity of individual refugee claimants as a security threat to the hosts, in some senses has become a self-fulfilling project, and is achieved by fragmenting and fractioning the identity in relation to very complex motives and patterns and processes of refugees seeking protection, fleeing conflict, fleeing persecution. And this aggregation of identity and systematically delegitimizing and disqualifying the refugee story, I think, has diminished very substantially access to protection and reinforces the denial of asylum. And in addressing these competing agendas of the securitization of nationals or the security and protection of asylum seekers and refugees on the other hand, it's quite clear in my view that European member states have firmly opted for the former, the securitization of nationals, not the protection of asylum seekers and refugees. And this has been achieved by, I think, by a progressive subordination of their security and their protection in really, I think, what is the most easily identifiable minority of migrants, the most vulnerable asylum seekers and refugees, whose identity, I've argued, has been formed and transformed and politicized in more than 3 decades of European policy making. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zetter, for a fascinating speech on something which resonates with some of the research I'm currently doing in the theory of refugee law, and especially the perception of the other from an existential perspective. At this point, I'd like to invite some questions, and if I may begin by using my position as chair to start by asking the first question. One of the things you touched upon in your speech was the notion of power. And power features very prominently in debates on identity, because the extent to which an institution, a group, can shape an identity, of course, depends on how much power they hold. And what you tend to find is that in shaping identity, it's very much a power struggle. And the group that holds the most power often succeeds in imposing their particular identity on a group. Of course, governments, the general public, the media, have a lot of power in shaping the identity of refugees. What I'd like to ask is how much power do refugees have in this process of identity formation? And do you think they're well placed? Do you think they hold? How much power do you think they hold to contribute to formation of their identity?
Would it, if I, you preempted your role, can I preempt your role in a different way? Would it be useful perhaps to take a number of questions? Would you mind?
Yes.
It might be.
Please, anybody
doing that, and then.
I just want to your comments in relation to European Court of Human Rights versus the European Union in terms of how they utilise refugees and asylum seekers.
One more question. We'll take them in threes.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about the Treaty agreement.
Yep. Okay, thanks for those questions. The question of power and how identities are formed and the power structures, the power struggles between refugee groups, particular refugee ethnicities on the one hand, and the, if you like, the architecture of power in the host country, as you say, represented by political interests, represented by institutional interests, the media, and so on. I think one could really, write a parallel paper to the one I've written, in which, rather than talking about securitization, one could look at the very imbalanced situation we now have, the very sort of process of imbalance that has evolved over the last 20 to 30 years in terms of the power of migrant groups in general, and I think refugee and asylum seeker groups in particular, vis-a-vis the way they can present their identity, the way they can articulate their claims, the way they can challenge, if you like, the formation of an identity, the ascribed and imposed identity. A few years ago, with some colleagues, we did a very interesting piece of work which was funded by the ESRC, which was looking at community-based organisations, refugee community-based organisations, particularly in London and Birmingham. And I think what we found very interesting in that research, and I suspect if we conducted it today, it would. This was where are we now? 2000. Well, this was about 7 years ago, and given what has happened in the last 7 years, I suspect what we found then is even more the case now. What we found was that there had been a kind of change in the way that those community-based organisations articulated what power they had, and that whereas perhaps up until the middle of the 1990s, refugee community-based organisations, both those that were based within the refugee communities themselves, as well as the broader national and advocacy organisations, like, for example, the Refugee Council, whereas up until about the mid-1990s, a lot of the work of both the refugee-based organisations and the wider community-based organisations representing their interests was concerned very much with issues, I think, of identity, of cohesion, of integration, of settlement, and community relations. In other words, looking very much at, I suppose, the kind of archetypal sort of positive dimensions that we ascribe to or wish migrant communities to have. There was a shift from that kind of discourse, if you like, that kind of representation of power, which was certainly not complacent, but represented a kind of self-confidence and I think a kind of outgoing identity. And what we noticed was that many of the community-based organisations had actually become rather more introverted, and what their role was very much to defend the status of asylum seekers and refugees, provide much more advice about legal representation, not so much public advocacy, but really a kind of private conversation, a private discourse, providing support, solidarity, looking at ways in which the increasing power of Europe, in this case UK immigration and asylum legislation, that whole raft of legislation which started in the early 1990s, was gradually restricting and making much more difficult, much more bureaucratic, much more legalistic, much more regulated the process of claiming asylum and the different statuses. And in a sense that's not a direct answer to your question, but I think it kind of reflects the way in which this imbalance of power has sort of played out in a very practical way in terms of the work of these refugee communities. So their power, if you like, was, and the struggle to exert their power was not a struggle and not a display of power in terms of rights, in terms of engaging the host community in an outward sense, but it was really a struggle to just sort of maintain a position against the kind of an onslaught, if you like, of control and restrictionism. So that's a kind of partial answer, I think, to your question, but I think it does dramatise very significantly this kind of imbalance of power and the movement from a kind of external representation of identity to a kind of internalisation and the defence of a status against, as I say, this kind of onslaught to restrict the process of claiming asylum. In terms of the European Court of Human Rights, I can't say very much about this. It's not an area that I've worked on, but the question you raised, I think, is something that I kind of need to think about more, because quite clearly what has been happening in Europe is that as Europe has increasingly harmonised its policies with respect to immigration and asylum, as the process of deterrence and restrictionism and control and regulation has become stronger, one could argue that the kind of counterbalance to that has been, okay, you've increased access, the legal access that claimants have in extremis to make, to justify and if you like, advocate their claims through supranational legal structures. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not at all familiar with those processes. I think what I would argue, and again, this is with sort of very little knowledge and understanding, my suspicion, I think, in terms of the role of the European Court in respect of these kind of issues, I think has probably been very limited. My understanding is that whilst individual cases are adjudicated upon, the extent to which that has really enabled or really enforced a reconfiguration of the fundamentals of European policy in the kind of way that I've portrayed it tonight, I doubt that very much has changed, quite honestly. And I can't, I'm afraid, speak in detail to that particular point. In terms of Trevi, there's a part in the paper that I didn't, just because of time, I didn't go into. What the Trevi group was, it was a grouping, a kind of informal grouping, almost a kind of precursor to some extent, not of the Dublin group, but it was an informal grouping of European interior ministries, which was formed in 1975, and it was responding particularly to terrorism and in the Middle East, because at that time there'd been a series of quite high-profile hijackings and hostage-taking of individuals as well as groups of people. And in Europe, particularly in West Germany, with the Munich Olympics, and in Italy as well, with the so-called Red Brigade and the perceived threat to the security of Italy there. And that, the Trevi group was really an attempt to look, it was the first attempt, I think, from the then European Commission, the European Community. Obviously, at that time, was it 10 member states was the core, if you like, of European states. It was their first attempt to begin to articulate and, or react to and articulate concerns, European-wide concerns about security in relation to migration as well as internal threats, which, as we see now 40 years later, has been played out in this enormous securitization agenda against migration and immigration, highly now articulated, highly instrumentalized. And as I say, the Trevi was, one can't imagine what bureaucrats sort of thought of this acronym and how they developed it, whether they thought of the Romance of Rome and how can we sort of articulate T-R-E-V-I or Trevi into, how can we use that acronym. But terrorism, radicalism, extremism, and violence international. I mean, it's almost beggars belief. It would be funny if it wasn't so serious. Well, it is funny, but it is serious. But this kind of European level foundation, really, I think what its significance now is perhaps rather limited. Its symbolic significance, I think, is more important because, as I say, it was this first attempt by European politicians to make this kind of conjuncture between migration and security threats. And it kind of went into abeyance because the Middle East terrorism and the hostage-taking, it was a kind of episode that died out, and as other kinds of political initiatives and profile raising of the political cause, particularly Palestinians, sort of developed in other ways. So in a sense, the actual instruments diminished, but symbolically, I think it was a very significant foundation, and both conceptually and policy terms developed this conjuncture, which, as I say, went into abeyance and then became resurrected, particularly in the 1990s, first of all with the Single European Act, and therefore free mobility in Europe, but at the same time as the globalization of asylum-seeking refugees developed with the very substantial influxes into Europe at that time. So I don't know whether that kind of answer. There's a lot written about it if you can dig back in the annals of the Commission.
3 further questions, please. One here, 2,
Yeah, in your talk, you mentioned the Fortress Europe idea. You almost alluded to it, so
yes.
You kind of didn't need to.
I've written about it.
Could you talk a little bit more about how that rhetoric, and particularly as a project rather than as a series of disjointed measures which have to relate to securitisation and migration, but actually explicitly drawing them together as a project, relates to the concepts that you talked about, and possibly extend the answer to include the widening of the mandate of the Frontex agency?
yes, please.
Actually, he took my first question, so I'll go straight to the second one, which is was for your comments on the racialization of the process.
Racialization?
Yeah, of the securitization process. Yeah, and the other one was about Frontex, so I think that's covered.
Yes, please.
To slightly play devil's advocate, it's an intrinsic duty of a nation state to protect its citizens, to securitize its citizens. The duty of protection of others is that the duty taken on when it ratifies international conventions. So you could say that the intrinsic duty is prior to the taken on duty. So it then boils down to how real is the threat from these others that are not the natural duty of the state, of the host state. And that surely is subjective, or is it objective? Can one actually measure this threat? How real is the threat, and how do you decide?
Okay, thanks. 3 again very challenging and interesting questions. Yes, I didn't use the descriptor of the ascribed identity of Fortress Europe, but I could have done. And I think what I would say there is that the development of Frontex, the concepts and notions of offshore processing, the response to the so-called Arab Spring and the flow of migrants from that process, relatively small flows that transpired from North Africa. I think all these are other sort of aspects, if you like, of the instrumentalization of the security threat. I'm not sure I can say much more than that, really. I think the notion of Fortress Europe, which in a sense, again, was very powerful in the rhetoric maybe 5 years ago, and I think was sort of very powerful in the rhetoric of developing this securitization agenda. One doesn't really hear that term used anymore, except perhaps pejoratively by people like many of us here. But in terms of the kind of political rhetoric, I think it's less evident. But it, without doubt, both as a concept and in terms of the specific instruments by which that sort of fortress is protected, I think speak very powerfully to this notion of securitization. It's the other side of the same coin, I think. Issues of racialization. I talked a little bit about this, I think, when my opening point about how European member states had developed the securitization agenda in response to a handful of countries where the majority of asylum seekers come from. And the racialization, self-evidently, is not an explicit part of that process of the way in which the paradox of those coming from countries who are most in need of protection are resisted by our claims to protection in terms of securitizing our values and our well-being. It's not racialized in a very explicit way, but I think the point that I didn't make, I alluded to it, is the way in which these kind of images of countries where the people pose a security threat to us are reflected, and a rhetoric is constructed which is taken up in the media, in public discourse, which is implicitly a kind of a racialized agenda. Quite clearly, part of political discourse plays into that agenda without making it explicit, but it resonates with and is reflected in the way the media then portrays the bogus asylum seekers, and usually then the subtext will be these countries which, by definition, isn't a surprise, they're Islamic, and that kind of rhetoric has a kind of self-perpetuating and self-fulfilling process. The third question, the kind of intrinsic or imposed obligations to protect and provide security. I like the way that you distinguish between those two dimensions, if you like. I think what I would say to that is, three things. One, there was an implication that somehow as you described, the taken on agenda of protection of refugees and asylum seekers is subjective, where somehow the intrinsic duty is not subjective. I would argue that the intrinsic duty is subjective. What we value, what we securitize, is, I think, a set of subjective processes. How those values, cultural identity, other kinds of norms are developed over time, how they're debated, how they're politicized, I would argue is a very subjective and contested process. There is no absolute intrinsic set of values to protect. So that's one thing. I don't think there's a kind of subjectivity on the one hand in terms of the taken on protection obligations as opposed to a set of objectively constructed intrinsic rights of protection. I think the second thing is that, and this sounds perhaps like a slightly kind of sort of aspirational point rather than a kind of academically or politically argued point. The fact of the matter is that European countries, all European countries, are signed up to the Refugee Convention. They have willingly, in fact, as we know, Britain was one of the first 13 signatories. We have willingly taken on these international obligations. We could say that part of our intrinsic values are not just in terms of our self-interest, but they are intrinsic values which have a global and a humanitarian perspective. So again, I like the dichotomy that you pose, but I would argue that, okay, they're taken on, but they're taken on partly because they reflect the kinds of intrinsic values we have of justice, humanity, protection and so on. And then, having taken them on, I think they then develop their own kind of power, if you like, within our national identity and discourse to be humanitarian, if I can put it in that way. The third point I would say is, if we conceive of this dichotomy and the kind of taken on right, the kind of obliged right through signing up to international conventions and so on, how real is the threat? What I think I tried to argue in my paper is that the problem I have with the notion of securitization is that, particularly when I was talking about it in terms of national and European-wide, national sovereignty and European-wide sovereignty, is that it is really very much the way it is perceived, the way it's constructed, the way the security threat is constructed, rather than objectively measured. And that's not to deny, obviously, that when a bomb goes off, it is frightening, and it is a heart-stopping process, both for the individuals and at a national level. And that is not in any way to deny that and the pain and the destruction it causes. But at the same time, I think what is insidious about it is that it is a constructed, it is a kind of constructive process. And the existential threat then becomes something which is perceived and is replicated and is enhanced in the public rhetoric in ways that I think then become, well, first of all, very disadvantageous to those who perhaps security is as much threatened as our own in terms of being persecuted in countries where refugees come from. And secondly, I think that threat itself, I think, develops its own momentum and then starts to feed into other debates like the racialization of identities and perceived threats and so on that come from different religious or ethnic groups.
Thank you. I think, given the time, we have time for one final question. Is anybody?
Any solutions?
How long
That's a short question.
Especially to the notion of this configuration of asylum and
I think the dismaying thing, if I can end on a kind of dismal, slightly depressing note, is that, which perhaps is not surprising given what I said tonight, is that in many ways these kind of issues, this kind of discourse, really hasn't kind of run a course in time. And in a sense, it's not a static position. Now, the positive perspective might be that any kind of politicization of an issue, particularly the issue of securitizing asylum, we're not in a fixed position. The optimistic view is that in time this will change, and that we will perhaps perceive this notion of the threat to have been misplaced and misguided. And that, in fact, asylum seeking and the arrival of refugees is not the kind of existential threat that it's been built up to. So the positive view, I think, is that through advocacy, through good research, through lobbying at national, international levels, I think we can show evidence, I think we can produce convincing evidence to really challenge a lot of the position that I described in this paper, but it takes a lot of work. And the optimistic view is that that kind of process can work through in time, and a more, how can I describe it, a more kind of benign regime might emerge. I mean, the downside is, of course, it could get worse. So the classic economist answer on the one hand, give me the one-handed economist, and let's go for the positive.
Thank you very much, Professor Zetter. If I could just add a few things, that I think that one thing that we've seen is that, well, the one thing history has shown us is that contracting states to the Geneva Convention have used it in many different ways and constructed refugee identity in many different ways. Of course, when the convention was signed and adopted, the original intention was that a refugee was somebody who had fled persecution before 1951, and then during the Cold War, when the protocol extended the temporal limit of the Refugee Convention, Cold War refugees were treated, was sort of epitomized refugee identity, and then following the collapse of the Balkans at the beginning of the 1990s, when Europe saw a mass influx of asylum seekers from Europe, and suddenly the barriers went up, and the identity of the refugee was conceived as one as an existential threat. And thank you very much for elucidating on the current state of the refugee, the current refugee identity, and how it's associated with securitisation. So on behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank you very much for a very intriguing, very insightful talk today. Thank you.